Yeah. Yes, I'm Christie, and I was writing about contemporary Asian female artists responding to Orientalism and Techno-Orientalism. So basically my research, I was looking at how Orientalism has evolved over time and how artists are responding to the present effects of Orientalism, and how that's developed into Techno-Orientalism. So there's like three sections that I was kind of trying to divide my thinking into, which was the neutrality of whiteness and the other, exoticism and stereotypes, and then going into Techno-Orientalism. So I wanted to look at how whiteness understands itself as the neutral by putting itself against an other, by something that's different. Because we're always analyzing, like, okay, how is this culture different? How is that culture different? But then we need to also look at what is it different to? So what makes it different? It's because whiteness tends to use the other as a foil to anchor its own identity as the universal and human experience. And that's where whiteness is benefited by its invisibility, because if you don't talk about race, if you don't bring up other races, then the assumption is that it's white. The default is that it's white, especially in Western countries. Like Canada and the US is mostly like what I'm looking at. And I think that Jin Mi-yoon's work looks at this pretty well, because she's addressing the group of seven, which has always been accepted as the authority on depicting Canadian identity, painting these landscapes of like broad, unpopulated, wild land, and claiming itself to be apolitical expressions of Canadianness. But by omitting anything which would seem other to the dominant culture, can't truly be universal. It omits the presence of Native Canadian and American people, it omits the presence of urban centers, and it omits the presence of the multicultural population. The only time that we question that is when Yoon puts a bunch of Korean Canadians against the paintings, and then we start having conversations about belonging and immigration. And if it was truly universal, that wouldn't even be a question, because it would encompass Korean Canadians. It wouldn't see that as other to the Canadian landscape. Her work is often reduced in a way to sort of like a lamenting demand for inclusion, by just pitting two polarized identities against each other, white versus other. And I think that's more reflective of the Western audience than the work itself, because I think she's looking at a lot of very complex nuances of identities. Partially part of it is how the relationship between immigrant groups, Korean Canadians, have with a colonized land. So like where do they stand in this dynamic of compared to Native Americans, a land that's been taken? Where do they belong in this land, and as a group that benefits from colonized land, even if they're not the colonizers themselves? But often, all that is kind of looked over, because critics tend to, we look at the group of seven and we say, oh, this is pure art for the ages because it's white artists, and then we look at Korean artists and we think it's part of the trend of identity politics. I was also looking at exoticism and stereotypes, because I was interested in how you could trace stereotypes throughout history, where they originated, what their purpose was, and then how they show up in our media today. So, the Orientalism that I see in our media is in fashion, in music industries, celebrity culture, social media. We see so many Instagram influencers and the little dresses with the chopsticks in their hair, and it's very normalized and accepted, and it's just it's aesthetic, it's pretty, and there's not too much thought put into it. but I was thinking about how it's essentially visual coding. A lot of the cultural items have become signifiers for the stereotypes. So when you wear those types of dresses, you're perceived as, sexualized, mysterious. There's that, romantic fantasy of the East that has showed up throughout history over and over again. It's like a trend that keeps recycling from, chinoiserie and Japanese, and it was popular in the 90s. It's popular now, and so I think that I was looking at how Liebel addresses that in her piece Hydra Monument, how she encodes herself as the stereotypes. She's sort of a sexualized Buddhist goddess figure, and she's projected herself on this huge inflated monument of like a sort of monster figure, and it's sort of satirizing the stereotypes. It's making it very confrontational in the face of the viewer who is confronted with this almost ridiculous image, and it's like, is this really how you see us? Is this really what you think and what you consume all the time without so much thought? And the balloon, it towers over the audience, but if you like push it because it's inflated, it'll bounce back at you. So it's just like relentlessly like challenging you. And in another way, Kim Soo-ja, instead of engaging with the gaze and challenging the gaze, she refuses the gaze. So she's turned around, she doesn't show her face, she's resisting being objectified and sexualized, because she knows that the Western audience will Orientalize her work, and they do that, and you can see that in the difference of presentation. The top one is how she presents it herself in her work Watari, which is about sort of meditative, introspective states. The bundles are often used to transport personal items, and they're all made from used duvets, so there's like a haunting echo of human touch to them. Her work is very introspective, and in no way is it, Orientalized and exotic. But Western audiences, they see the pattern fabric, and that's an immediate signifier of the Orient to them, and so they place it in this location where that's all you see. There's no reference to her actual meaning. So to subvert this, she created a video of herself she was traveling, and like showing the actual sense of meditative, nomadic experience that she wanted to convey. And this subverts the Orientalizing gaze. And so with Techno-Orientalism, I was looking at how that like evolved from classical Orientalism. So if Orientalism sort of produces a pre-modern, archaic idea of the East to put against the modern West, then Techno-Orientalism comes, like there's sort of a representational challenge, because all of a sudden Asia has technology, and Asia is known for technology. So then how do you keep them as, the pre-modern culture, keep representing them in that way, and keep representing the West as the modern culture? And so the solution is to sort of, draw from stereotypes that have existed since, the railroads, how Asians are industrious and inhumanly efficient. They're good at math and science, but humanistically, they're backwards. They don't understand values such as liberty and justice and humanism. It keeps those ideas as being purely white concepts, keeping freedom white, basically. And it sort of started to come up when they repealed racialized immigration acts. And there was imports of Japanese capital into the U.S. economy. And, it's always what happens when the economy starts to, get weird. They get scared. So that was sort of the return of Yellow Peril. So science fiction specifically started representing Asians as, they would start having, movies or whatever with a Western subject against a dystopian Asian backdrop. So a Western savior who knows, because, they're human and they're relatable, they save the day from these Asians who are basically robotic cyborgs. And so Mariko Mori is, responding to these representations of Asians in this way. Stereotypes like the, Japanese cyborg lady, the sexualized goddess, the dragon lady. She compounds all of that into this image of herself and almost uses herself as a bait. Like, she covers herself in the stereotypes, but then she doesn't allow you to consume it in a gratuitous way. So she blacks or whites out her eyes and makes them all silvery, which contrasts with like the long history of representing the Asian, or the female body, where they sort of like look back at the viewer kind of like, coyly or sheepishly, like inviting you to look at them. In this case, she's not inviting you to look at her. She's kind of looking through you, almost daring you, like, I dare you to sexualize me. And by controlling this image of herself, she's retaining her identity, and therefore she retains her power. And this piece is by Joyce Eugene Lee, and it's similar to Mariko Mori's in that it's responding to the specifically Chinese stereotypes. So Mariko Mori's is looking at the Japanese stereotypes, which is, robotics, AI, innovation. And China is seen more as the site of oppressive, hyperproduction, subhuman labor forces. So as a performance piece, she was at an art fair and she was selling these little buttons that said "Made in China, sold in the USA," but they were actually produced in the USA, which made them cost 5 times more to produce. And the little boxes had like a star that represents the American flag with like a cutout, like the Apple logo, to reference, their controversies about workers' rights. So essentially, she wants the audience, by having them engage with her work, she wants them to confront the paradox of their distance with those who make their goods and their demand for cheaply made products, but also with their wariness of China as a capitalist power set to topple America, again, because they think of it as an inhumanly efficient manual labor force, which has always been the foil to Western liberal humanism. That's it.
Thanks a lot. It's a lot of points, yeah? Especially, let's just don't talk. There's what else?
I do have a point that you brought up is like reinforcing stereotypes in clothing, and I think my question is towards trying to like think about this coherently. Where do you draw the fine line between something being culturally appropriated and something that's just like cultural appreciation? It's always so interesting when we call out something that's like not appropriate. It's almost like us as a minority group, our voices aren't necessarily heard, so it's like brushed off so easily. And the other question I have is, it's so interesting when we see something that's not right because we are born here and we see discrimination against us. But
So second question, speak loudly.
yeah,
Second question is?
the second question is just like when we call something out as cultural appropriation, and then it's so interesting when people from like, let's say like the homeland says like, oh, this person is just appreciating her culture. Like this counter argument between like,
Well, I think like the issue with when you ask, like for example, a Chinese American versus a Chinese person in China, is that the perception in the East is that America and Canada are white countries. The default of our countries is white, like what I was saying with the neutrality. So like obviously you would think like, okay, it's like, a white person and they're just appreciating the culture, but then what is our position as people who live in Canada and the US when there's like white people who profit off of the coding of our stereotypes into the clothing? It's a difficult question because I don't know the solution, like how to define appropriation and appreciation, but the issue is when you're profiting off of these ideas of mystery and exoticism and like sexiness when those are stereotypes that were constructed in the first place to keep us out of the country.
Different kind of reaction, taking one and rejecting another. So in a way, that double exploitation in some way is going on when we address the negative aspect of appropriation. So we like them when they build a label, and then we like to exploit some of those exotic things they can sell, but in terms of recognition, it's never full and fair recognition to the contribution to this group made. That's where the anxiety arises, I guess, which is very common, as Christie said. Oftentimes, this kind of dynamic between racial groups or the tension is not very well known in the, let's say, in East Asia. Japanese, Japan, living in Japan, Korean living in Korea, or Chinese living in China, they often see this debate coming from, let's say, what Western metropolis is. Why should they be so serious? You know, like there are such a different kind of perceptions, because they might think that, oh, what's wrong with white people appreciating Chinese dress? That's a kind of typical reaction. 10 out of 10 people would say that on the Chinese street. Or Japanese, when some Japanese manga adopted by Hollywood and main character become white person instead of, let's say, someone who resembles and echoes the Asian character. And the Japanese in Japan, they think it is okay and good and cool, while there's such a tension within America that it's cultural appropriation with a negative connotation, right? So yeah. So there are many hands. Just I've forgotten your name. I think I know you. Zeb. Yes, Zeb and Jay and Pena. Yes. So who gonna? Well, yeah.
Oh, okay. As someone who's part of the diaspora, I always think about, like, am I appropriating my own culture? Because like, I wasn't born or raised in China. So like when I used to have long hair, I used to like put chopstick in my hair, and like in my mind, I was like reclaiming it. But then I'm also thinking about, okay, well, actually, was I performing it? So I don't know. I guess I just want to get your thoughts on like when you reclaim like really stereotypical things. Are you actually reclaiming it, or are you just kind of like performing it for like to appease that case?
Yeah, like that's something I think about a lot too, and I think I have to be careful of that because I am half white. But I think like when it comes to art, like it's different how it's perceived versus like, you know, you wearing chopsticks as a fashion statement versus you know, an art piece. Like obviously that's going to have like, you're expecting people to engage with it a lot more critically. And I think, you know, they do things in their work to make it so that it's not easily consumable as stereotypes, but it is tricky because it's like there are people who are just ignorant enough to look at it and be like, oh, okay, because she's Asian. But like, I guess like at a certain point it's like, that's on them. People who can engage critically will understand what you're trying to do. But then like when it comes, that's with art, I don't know about like, you know, just fashion statement, Instagram posts, like it gets a lot more complicated.
Jay and then Jeff. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, to what degree do you think these stereotypes are connected to like East and West, their understanding of each other's political systems? Because you were mentioning like the West maybe themselves as like sort of being like
Neutral. Default.
Like understanding freedom and liberty and individualism, that they might view Asia as like industrious, hardworking, or lacking in those things. So like I feel like that has a lot to do with kind of democracy and communism. Like I have no knowledge whatsoever of how like the political system actually works in China. So
Yeah, I think it's like less to do with how it actually works in China and those countries because, you know, that is changing, that has changed a lot through the years, but this idea of, you know, the US as this liberal justice force is, you know, started from like the conception of the US, and I think it's just a very colonial thing, how they thought like, oh, we're bringing like, enlightenment to the rest of the world who doesn't understand these like primitive people who don't know like our modern ways. It's just a mentality because they want to see themselves as a hero, right? Like it's not just about being like pitting themselves as the neutral, but also as the good guys. It's like a movie or something. So the East plays the bad guys or plays the people who need to be saved. And I think you can see that in the way they show, like present wars. Like even in the war in Iraq, they show it as like, oh, these poor Middle Eastern people, we're there to help save them. When it's not the case.
Leon and Jeff. Jeff, do you mind, or Jeff, do you want to come in here? No? You had a question, right?
Oh,
No? Okay, Leon.
My question has less to do with appropriation, but I was wondering, do you think there's a similarity between Kim Soo-ja's turning back against the viewer and Jimmy Yoon's turning around her subject? Do you think they operate in the same way as they? I don't know if that really returns the gaze, but it almost just avoids the gaze.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think they operate in the same ways?
I'm not sure, because with Jinmi Yoon's, like, she also has ones that are facing you, and then she has ones that are facing back. But I think because the way it's presented is like at the corner of the wall, so it's kind of like this like cycle between like the painting, then the audience, and the painting again. And I know with Kim Soo-ja, a lot of her work, she uses her body as like a vessel through like, you put yourself in that position, you like kind of see it. So I think maybe both of them have that kind of like transitional sense. Yeah, but I don't know if it's necessarily they're both refusing the gaze in that way.
Jimmy Yoon's series has both versions, right?
Mm-hmm.
One version, group of I don't know how many are the one turn around, like look as if facing the landscape painting. Another one is actually looking at us, and in the background, with the background of the landscape. So in a way, overall, it is not about them actually. In the Jimmy Yoon's case, it is not about the subject, but the way that it allows us to question how the a group of 7 represented painting of so to speak white male artists have been made as a kind of epitome of national identity, which this position may allow us to question, because the uneasiness that coming from that juxtaposition is the whole purpose of that. So it is less about the returning the gaze, but it's more of questioning our gaze, not through returning of the way that, so to speak, Libel or Marco Mori does, I think. And have a kind of also my comment and intervention into the question Jay have asked about. I think your question was also, to what extent it is reflection of actual political situation phenomenologically, rather than presenting it as all ideological. Because it's seemingly, let's say, China is doing this authoritarian one-party system, and Korea has hit that history, and Japan has that history, while seemingly Western side has been somewhat a promoter of liberal democracy, seemingly. So to balance it out, of course, that historical kind of evolution has been somewhat indicating that, but however, it does not mean every single moment when, let's say, this kind of discourses of the, so to speak, fixed notion of West is always has been like this, and the rest has been always like this. That fixed notion is, in a way, mechanism in which the West have been using to justify their colonization of the world as well. And that discourse traces back to the 19th century British civilizing vision. To hide their colonial enterprises, they said, we're going there, let's say, conquest other land to civilize this barbaric people. However, what was happening was, it was an ideological rhetorical device to justify their exploitation of resources and everything. So they took full advantages, but then on surface they give a British education which epitomized liberalism and things, but in actuality they make hierarchy of race, right? So that paradox should be more actively emphasized, and that's what I think the speaker is doing and we try to do. So that stereotypes is very dangerous. It's ideological. That's maybe all we want to emphasize and talk about right now. More questions? It was very interesting. That generated a lot of interesting questions. Any more questions? One more? No? All right. Thanks a lot. Yep.
Hello everybody, my name is Richard Luong. I'm in my third year of the Visual and Critical Studies program at OCAD, and I'm presenting my research paper, which is also a film analysis entitled Directing Orientalism, The Scent of Green Papaya. And it was a Vietnamese language film released in 1993 and directed by a French-Vietnamese director named Tran Anh Hung. And it also features his marriage partner, Tran Nhu Yen He. I kind of anglicized it. And she plays the protagonist in the second half of the film. And the story follows the growth and development of a young Vietnamese girl who is a servant for an affluent Vietnamese family. And in this first half of the film, she's played by a young girl, I don't know her name, and she is portrayed as somebody who is curious, inquisitive. She's interested in the small details in life, like insects and the seeds inside of green papaya. And in the second half of the film, which is a 10-year span, she becomes mute and illiterate, so she loses her ability to speak, write, and read. And that's mainly because she, over time, assumed a subordinate and subservient role to her host family. And in the second half of the film, she leaves her original host family and is then employed by an old family friend. His name's Huynh, and he is an educated man. He was educated in France at the Conservatory, Paris Conservatory, a college of music and dance, and he's a pianist and composer. And so my thesis was really trying to think about how a person can inhabit two identities. So Tran Anh Hung, the director, is both Vietnamese and French. He was born in Vietnam, but he immigrated to France when he was 12 at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. And so with the release of the film in 1993, he was about, I think, in his early 30s or so. And so I was really interested in seeing how somebody who is both Asian and Western can also partake in Orientalism or self-Orientalism through cinema. So this is one of the earliest scenes where we see the protagonist. Her name is Mui. It's spelled M-U-I. And in this scene, you see Huynh in the middle. He's in the middle of composing, I guess you could say. And she is lightening up the room. She was preparing dinner, and she was navigating around him while he was just sitting in the center. And I forgot to mention Orientalism, and so I think that I should describe what that is. And so Orientalism was a concept developed by Edward Said, where he described this figure called the Occident, who is a Western scholar, literary, poet, artist, who created constructions and representations of non-Western places, people and cultures. And he urges us to analyze these representations because these representations are not the truth. And so I try to use that as my foundation to think about how this film is also a representation, and that we should look at it from not just purely from a fictitious or narrative point of view, but also how style, genre, devices can also be used to reveal the kind of underlying cultural and power relations. And in this case, culture, I mean the binary between the East and the West, and power meaning gender. So I'll be exploring Orientalism through Vietnamese women. And so in this scene, she does not speak, but her role still says a lot. In Tring T. Minh Ha's article, The Image in the Void, she talks about the concepts of invisibility and visibility, and she uses that as analogies to explore ideas of being ahistorical and also historical. So she describes how in Western historical practices, the enlightened Western scholars interested in writing down tangible documents of the past, and those who do not are ahistorical and also inferior. And so I try to use that as a lens to understand how Mui is invisible, but also ahistorical and inferior compared to Huynh, who was educated in the West. In this scene, I was interested in how clothes can also represent tradition and modernity. So in this scene, Mui was dressing up. She's wearing the traditional Vietnamese dress called an áo dài, which just means long shirt or long dress. And she was dressing herself up while Huynh was away from home. And the camera is completely transparent. The camera follows her every movement. She bathes and cleans herself, and she puts on red lipstick. And so the viewer is investing all of this time seeing her become a traditional idealized woman, whereas at this moment, Huynh does not experience that investment. And so this idea of the silent woman in cinema who exhibits this kind of visual pleasure comes from Laura Mulvey's article called Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, where she describes the male gaze and how this, quote, the silent image of woman is still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning, end quote. And in this final scene, there's an article by Nguyen Thuy Tran called Women as Nation, Traditional and Modernity Narratives in Vietnamese Histories. And in this article, she was writing about the typical ways in which Vietnamese historiography has been written. And that is how Vietnam is different or unique from its neighboring Asian countries like China, because before the introduction of the patriarchal Confucian system, it was a matriarchal society. And so this narrative, whether it was true or not, was used by French anthropologists, philologists, archaeologists, and scholars to create a narrative that portrayed Vietnamese women as both having one foot in tradition and the other foot in modernity. So there's a French anthropologist, his name is Claude Maitre, Maitre. He was the director of the French School of the Far East, and in 1908, he reviewed the legal records of the Lê dynasty, which was from the 15th to the 18th centuries in Vietnam, and he discovered that Vietnamese women had property rights. So he used this as a way to argue that Vietnamese women had more freedom and liberty compared to their Chinese counterparts. And so this was a way to set this kind of duality in Vietnamese women. And so in this scene, what you see here is Mui. She is learning how to read and write, and her husband now is teaching her. And he doesn't just teach her how to read or write, but also how to act and behave. There's this part in the film where she's slouching while she's writing, and he taps her on the shoulder to tell her to kind of like sit up straight. And so with this idea of the Vietnamese woman being both traditional, and in this case being subservient and listening to her husband, she is also Western and modern because she is learning from a Western man. And that's all.
A lot of interesting questions might come from you. Hi, Marie-José. Professor Lisa, right? Marie-José. She teaches the architectural history and color culture as well. So.
And now I'm the associate dean, so I don't teach that much, you know that.
I know, yes. But anyways, we are about to start the question and answer time. And
Where's the your slide? Yes, can you fix what?
any questions? Florence.
Thank you for that presentation. I was wondering if.
Florence, could you speak loudly because we need to sign to record your testimony.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering if, well, I don't think it's possible to like really differentiate these things, but the difference between, or specifically the Orientalism, like gendered Orientalism, or just like specifically like homeland sexism versus Orientalist sexism. Yeah, and how I did notice that most of the scene analysis was focusing on like feminine character. Yeah, if you had any thoughts about that.
Sorry, what was the question?
I guess if you saw a distinction between like Vietnamese patriarchy versus Orientalist sexism, or like gendered expectations differing based on where that might be coming from.
I can help you with that. I just think in case because Richard has been working hard with the camera, so he seems a little tired as well. So it's a homeland. I think it's a very well said. Homeland sexism as traditionally, let's say, the gender hierarchies and so sexist, and so she's become objectified in that culture, as opposed to Orientalism as a transcultural dimension that she's objectified by, let's say, Western male. But in this case, this is not the Orientalism as such, because he is embodiment of. Is it multiracial person himself,
No.
or is it So those as questions. So where
I mean, like, what I tried to do was to complicate the kind of Occident and Oriental relationship, because I think, like, oftentimes it's talking about Western people, as in, like, people from Europe versus people from Asia. And so I was just interested in, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not too sure.
You needn't worry about that. We have a lot of also audience participants who can also just make a commentary if you think that you have certain also answers in ways of multi-directional conversation. Yes? Again, Christie.
I think it has a lot to do with context as well, right? This is a movie that I think was predominantly geared towards a Western audience, if I'm right?
I believe so. Yeah.
So I think, I mean, we, generally speaking in this room, we're all talking about a East Asian forum here, so perhaps our view of it may be different, but I think in context, I think perhaps we could fairly say that it is more of an Orientalist gaze in this situation.
I actually agree with that because it is like, I think you used that expression, self-orientalization. This is maybe a feeling that the subject himself, and also Vietnam was colonized by the French for how many decades is it exactly?
Like 1880s until like the 1940s, 50s.
So almost like 5, 6 decades. Is that 5, 6 decades? So in a way that how those once colonized post-colonial subjects, despite their, let's say, the Asian heritages, they embody themselves are constantly producing self-orientalizing images. And this one, in a way, epitomized those internalized, orientalizing gaze, which is actually performed by Oriental subject himself. And I have a questions regarding, I found interesting that your argument that how she overall presented as those traditional submissive and demure representation of submissive and demure femininity, which is just key ingredient of this Oriental representations. Want to see Oriental woman as that way, and also Orientalism, in terms of gender, is always female. Orient is always female, and the female objectified and meant to be destined to be sexualized as well. Not only East Asia, but if it is, let's say, Algeria, by French, Algeria is a woman there, objectified and sexualized. But then the film have a turn that she started learning things from him, read and write, and she also put in makeup, and all of a sudden the very bold makeup with a red dress, and which almost like the transition to sort of a more forthcoming femininity, which if we put the cultural dimension, like forthcoming femininity is often regarded as Western, right? Overt sexiness is something celebrated, while in Asia, as you know, that ideal femininity is not about overt sexiness, it's a demure, subdued sexiness. The sexiness is not even term that actually I associate with as anything that very different dimensions of femininity. I wonder whether you have any comments on those different kind of presentation of femininity, idealized femininity. Just a few more comments.
So like what I thought was kind of interesting was that in this scene here, there's I think maybe a couple minutes of just the protagonist by herself, and she's going through a sort of metamorphosis where she's first dressed in her kind of like, I guess, house clothes, her like servant clothes, I guess you could say, while he's not home, and then you see her transforming into the kind of like epitome of the Oriental woman. And so I just thought that that was kind of a service to the Western viewer, which is something that he doesn't experience himself. And so I thought that that was kind of interesting, how even though he doesn't see it, we still see it.
Too many comments. I have actually comments. It's one of the typical also grammar, if you have noticed, if it is produced for Western gaze. Again, like those West as a liberator discourses that Christie well articulated in the previous presentation. Again, this kind of, including those scenes where she becomes something demure to forthcoming by putting more bold makeup on bold clothing, the popping out. It's in a way that echoes those liberated. She, in a way that she's being liberated by sexualizing her. And I found this kind of grammar or rhetoric which is often used in many different media productions and entertainment. It's quite intriguing as well as disturbing as well. Because femininity doesn't mean that the femininity we want to achieve or celebrate is not it's not just about the overt sexiness, right? But then oftentimes in media, entertainment discourses, that overt sexiness, always putting strong makeup, is always regarded as some kind of Western notion of liberalization, which is meant to be celebrated within the limited discourses. So I found that is very interesting. Any other comments and questions? Oh, there's a hand behind. All right, here, Jessica.
I haven't seen the film, but I've seen like people. I think a lot of Western people like know of the film, and in the way like they appreciate it is like how I'm familiar with like how people appreciate Wong Kar-wai in like Wong Kar-wai, like In the Mood for Love, you know that movie? Oh, okay. But I was saying like because I really like and connect to Wong Kar-wai's films, but I know that the way people recognize his films is not, because his films are actually not representative of like a more I don't know, authentic Chinese, like because he has a very like I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I don't know. I'm just curious as to like if you have any friends who like, oh, I know that movie like as like the I guess it's like if anyone knows a Vietnamese film, it would be this one. Like, how do you like? Does that make you feel a certain way? Is it like?
Not really.
Not really.
Really enjoyed this one too.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, you know, I think it's possible to enjoy it and also be critical of it. Like, just because I'm critical of it doesn't mean I don't enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, just like because I'll just feel sort of weird when like I don't know, like someone who isn't Chinese will be like, oh, like I know that film and like I love like the cheap hall that everyone wears. It's like so beautiful, but it's like. But that's like not. I don't know. I just feel strange. I'm like, yeah, I agree and everything, but it's like.
I have
it's not representative.
Two questions. Two about Wong Kar-wai. How many of you? Okay, I think it's generational. I grew up watching this. It's from 1980. Is it 1993? Okay, so many of young students must not have. How many of you know this film? Have seen this film? Send only two. My goodness. Three. Yeah, it's like I mean, this is like one of the classic, which I just only remember as a beautiful film without thinking Orientalism or anything. It's just again also East Asia in the northern side. Also, there is this kind of inner Asian Orientalism going on. Oh, Vietnamese, the beautiful, there is a little bit of otherization, objectifying to each other. Things are also there. So the question about the Wong Kar-wai, and to what extent, I never asked this question to Chinese friends, for instance. Do you think that, or do people think that Wong Kar-wai's film is, let's say, more than 50% geared toward Western gaze? I see the answer is already yes. I see. Okay, so it is not necessarily regarded as among Chinese community that as a representation of somewhat reality or experiences, more of entertainment for the Western audience.
Recently, I have like a Chinese friend, international student, who's like, why do all you CBCs like Wong Kar-wai so much? Because we like reference it in our like works, at school and stuff. Mm-hmm. And he sees like that trend is like I'm CBC, like Canadian-born Chinese, likes Wong Kar-wai and likes to use like his imagery.
So that's a kind of problem we often encounter, and some of those visual products always become highlighted as if it is a representation of the culture, and we all experience the frustration in relation to that. And in terms of the Vietnamese film production, this is like perhaps one of the most popular, well-known film production which is funded by not Western. It is actually Vietnamese production, is it? Is it Western or is it Hollywood? No.
I think it's French.
It's a French, I see.
The funny thing is that the story is based in Vietnam, but the set itself is actually in France. Like they reconstructed the entire thing, so it's not actually Vietnam. So, you know.
So it's very Orientalist film and funded by, definitely, for the entertainment of French audience, 100%. Is there any kind of film productions from Vietnam that in fact counter this type of maybe overproduction of Orientalized visual language, which is in fact byproduct of colonialism, definitely. It is not just produced by French, but also French, Vietnamese, who Vietnamese themselves are producing a lot of these things as well. Is there any counter?
I can't really think of any. Like there is this one film that I feel like it's also, I guess, kind of has its own issues. I forgot what it was called, but it's about this mother who has her child taken from her. And then she becomes this like crazy like fighter, like she just like beats the hell like out of like all the guys just to kind of like get her child back. But I think that kind of reinforces this idea that women or like mothers are supposed to be, you know, there for their children like at all costs. So even though it does portray her as somebody who's strong, I think it still reinforces that kind of like motherhood.
Any other questions? Yes, Jake.
I was just really curious about, like, what was the structure of the matriarchal society, like, of Vietnam? Because that, I didn't even know about that, yeah.
I'm not too sure myself. I just know that when it comes to, like, the folk tales and fairy tales, it's often centralized around women and, like, mothers. And then in a lot of, like, Vietnamese or articles and books about Vietnam, before they get into the Chinese domination period, they'll always talk about how Vietnam was different and unique because it was just a matriarchal society somehow. I can't think of any details, but.
Can I ask when was the time the Confucianism were introduced to Vietnam and were they?
I can't think at the top of my head. But then the period itself was, I think, about 1,000 years. Yeah, on and off. I think there's like 4 major periods, but spanned over 1,000 years. Yeah.
So a lot of research to be done. Vietnam is very different also within the Asian kind of sphere, and also in Vietnam War, apparently there's interesting discourses between Vietnam and United States. And Vietnam is a victor. Well, they, you know, it's a country who won the Vietnam War officially. So there's an interesting dimension which you never hear unless you're really digging into Vietnamese history and etc. And also I learned about the strengths of matriarchy from reading Richard Luong's work, and so it was very interesting too. A lot of research to be done. All right, thanks a lot, and thank you. Ooh, I like this. All right. Next person is Jessica Liu, and we're going to see some artwork now. All right. That's better. I think strategically that's better. We're going to assist you. It's almost enacting the scroll painting tradition, which is not a landscape painting, but it's artist's own self-portrait. I don't know whether it's a self-portrait or not. So, yeah. Introduce your name and the title, at least, guys.
Title? What's title? Oh, the title.
Titles.
I thought you meant like my title. I don't have a title. I'm Jessica Liu, and I'm going to present a presentation called Painting My Own Being in the World, Falling in and Out of past and contemporary. And I wanted to present my works today because I think in the last year I've come to like this transitional point where I've been sort of like floating around most of my life, I guess. And then now I have this sort of like, I don't know, I have like something in me, a confidence in me. Anyways, I'd like to start. Oh, it's gonna blink. It's an effect that I added. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna start by reading this short poem that I wrote, which I think is relevant to my work. I'm just gonna play a video also that I created while I read it. Okay. Just go to the middle somewhere. Okay. So, never-ending space with nowhere to go. There is a never-ending river filled with something other than water. There are two transparent fish forever revolving each other. On one side is a young king, and on the other side sits a young philosopher. The river flows between them. The young king reaches into the river and grabs one fish, but it escapes. The revolving fish are startled. Their circle is interrupted. They can only swim forward now. The king immediately starts chasing behind them. The curious philosopher follows closely behind. The space is changing, the air unsteady, the ground starts shaking. The two men are tripping over uneven earth, but they keep chasing. A great amount of time must have passed, as the king looks much older when he finally catches one of the fish, struggling in his hands. But shortly after, the fish starts to glow with such a bright light that blinds the king. He lets go and the fish keeps swimming. The philosopher, too, looks much older when he, too, grabs hold of a fish. The fish is calm in his hands. In fact, she isn't moving. But not long after, she slowly melts into a sand-like substance and slips through the philosopher's fingers back into the river. The two men get older. They chase, catch, the fish escapes their hands. I don't know why they're chasing. I heard once that one of the fish is wisdom. I heard once that the fish is life, wealth. The rumors change as time changes, but the men keep chasing. Yeah. So this poem in my work lately represents like where I view myself in the world right now. Not really knowing how to like navigate on land or road. Actually, recently I was applying for this submission and it asked a question saying, how do you relate to land? And I said I don't because I feel like how I feel like on land is like a fish like swimming around and around, like being able to come in and out of places and borders and time and past and present. And I think it is like, it's definitely a result of, you know, being a Chinese girl growing up in Canada, the cultures and the sort of constant turmoil of like the East and West, like fighting with each other. But I think it's also part of like who I am. I think I was born this way. But for a very long time, I was like, I'll just put my painting. But for like most of my time up until now, I've just been like really confused and like fighting with like what I'm supposed to be, and feeling disconnected, disassociated with what's in front of me here and now. Anything that's like reality, I feel like I can't grasp it and I can't connect to it, and I can be a part of a community for a little bit, but then I'll feel so uncomfortable and I don't know why, or I don't know if I'm spoiled or whatever. But it's just like, and it's like, it was numbing for a while. And even when I created work at school, I was like, I just have like so much emotion, but I can't, because I can't connect to things. I don't know how to get it out in the ways that I'm supposed to with art. And it was really stressful. But as I was sort of forced to do assignments, I was forced to like do my research and I realized there are some things that I do connect to, such as like films and music, and then also knowledge. And I want to say also a part of like why I was feeling so floaty was also my upbringing is like my mom was pregnant with me and sort of like abandoned her life and family and just came over here and had me here, and she was like, it's perfect, it's just the two of us, but it's like that leaves me with no like strings to anyone or anywhere or roots in the ground, so I'm sort of like floaty. And there's nothing to sort of like substitute that tangibleness. Anyway, all these things just make me feel floaty. As I was researching more into the music that I liked, I'm inspired by Chinese hip hop because I feel like they're at a really good time right now where there's like this raw truth coming out, and it's coming out of music and it's affecting a lot of people. I'm also connected to So Young's classes where I could figure, in a selfish way, but I could figure out my past and like why things the way they are, why my family is the way they are.
You're not crying, right?
No, I don't know. And then, yeah, it's the backstory. I feel like it's important. But now, with these things I've sort of connected, I'm able to now, I've come to the realization that I am just this like floating fish. And actually, what Sonia said earlier, this like multi-directional way, that I don't have to move in a certain way and be a part of a community, but that I can move in and out of these spaces freely. And it's a privilege because now I have like, I can be empathetic. Anyways. So that's sort of like the backstory behind these paintings. Not to say that I'm like in this really positive place, because I still do feel disconnected all the time. But yeah, so these are a few of the paintings. Oh, I can pass the paintings around.
After this, I will help you.
Oh.
Yeah, after all
this?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what else I have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this your portrait?
No. Oh, these are like some actresses, or this is not based on anyone that I think is significant. I just used sort of the face. She's a Taiwanese actress, Su Qi. And I also wanted to say I feel connected to people who I've recently like been really touched by Ai Weiwei and MIA. I don't know if you guys know. She's a Tamil pop artist. People who use sort of like this floatiness that they feel to reach out to others through their art. And for me, it's like at their core, it's like it's about love for humanity, which is the direction that I'm trying to go to. Because I think, as I was saying, for me, the privilege of being in this position, to be empathetic of like many different places and to be able to move freely, is that I can like start to develop a love for humanity, and I want to tell the stories. Yeah. I also want to say, in the poem, the young king represents like King Solomon in the Bible, and the young philosopher represents Confucius, who are also people I relate to, and they're like way in the past. But King Solomon wrote a passage in the Bible after, in his old age, being like, everything is meaningless. And he was known to be like one of the richest and like most powerful, as well as the most wisdom kings of the Middle East. And then there was Confucius, who I was connected to this in his old age as well. He said why Confucius was sad, and he in a way didn't feel connected to, because in his own hometown, his teachings were not being practiced. But yeah, my point is that, I don't know, I feel connected, I feel disconnected, but I'm encouraged to move forward, and this is the product of it right now. Yeah, basically. Yeah. Yeah, can pass
There are
them.
more images.
Oh, yeah, these are just fun images. I think this is like, representation of me right now. I'm like ready to move forward. This is a digital work, like digital collage that I made recently. This one as well. Yeah. Go back to this one. Yeah. Oh, do you have any questions?
Yes, she's a hip hop girl nowadays.
No.
All right.
Yeah.
So it is not nice fetching transition, isn't it, from analysis of some films and things and to someone who talks about their own practices. Yeah, I intentionally mixed all these things because that's precisely our everyday, that we constantly analyze something else as well as we're looking inward, and so the syncretic format I devised here is to emulate precisely our everyday multidirectional confusions that constantly distracted, attracted, and confused, intrigued, everything. So now question time to Kristen. Yep. Kristen. Oh, Jessica. I'm sorry.
Oops, sorry. So I really identify with what you're saying. I think probably all of us do in this room, right? We're all kind of stuck in between, and I think it makes the journey a little bit harder sometimes because there isn't a direct course that we can see. Like we can't really tell from our parents where we should be going because it's a completely different world from them. But you sound really hopeful, and like you said, you're finding a new direction to move into. So where do you see your work moving next? Is there a different process that you're looking towards, or?
I think next, like I was saying, like I'm inspired by Ai Weiwei and MIA in that like they tell stories about like humanity, and they come from like this deep love for humanity, which I like connect to in a certain way. Yeah, so I want to move towards like I want to use my understanding of myself to sort of like tell stories of others, and also technically I wanted to add that like I was feeling like I couldn't express the way I wanted to because of the ways that we were supposed to draw and paint. But now if you see, it's like I use like, I don't know, a lot of different things and put them together, and that I can like, I feel like I can express freely in, so I think I'll continue with that. Yeah.
Do you want to come back to it?
Do you think your process will, like, how do I say this? Do you think your process informs your own self-discovery as well as, like, your continuing work?
Process, like in what way?
Like you've used some digital collage now,
Okay, yeah.
moving away from like traditional drawing and painting.
Yeah.
Do you think that's, like, I know it's reflexive, like one informs the other, but do you find that moving into digital work has informed your process of self-discovery?
I think so, yeah. Digital, yeah. I took a class this semester where we had to make 50 collages for the first assignment, and he said you could do some digital, and I was like doing the manual ones, I was like, oh, this is so strange, and I'm like, don't want to do this, but then like once I got to digital, everything like made sense, so I feel like that's definitely, there's like there's like, because things move so fast, I can like put the emotion of what I do by hand, but there's also this like irony to them. I don't know. that speaks for like kind of our generation, I think, which is interesting. Yeah.
I found it interesting when you said that when you were, feeling constantly floating and disconnected, but then not fully explaining the connection, which, however, it's very well researched area how you can overcome that, and through, in fact, so discovery of self can be conducted through also actively speaking of the problem or expressing it, and also finding connection through the trauma problem with others, that of others. So you use the term empathetic. So you identify yourself with the actresses who, I remember you told me about a story that she's kind of brutalized and things, right? And I think this psychologist will tell you, if you pay $150 per hour, that kind of empathetic relations in a way created or can be a therapeutic processes for the patient who suffer from those little bit sense of disconnection, disorientations, by actively speaking and looking for also other who suffer same, and in fact connections and confidence in speaking out and getting out of one's shell can be established through that type of connections, reconnecting oneself to the word. Not to other great thinkers, but to other patients or others who had the similar experiences. So that is one of my research area, by the way. Trauma memory is one of my area of expertise. So that was very interesting. And it was very good to see some of other works that I haven't seen before. We had this little session last year. Anyways, any other questions, please? Yep.
I have a comment.
Yep, comment and question, yes.
Recommend to read Yoko Tawada, who's a Japanese-German writer. So in her collection, Where Europe Begins, she has this story called The Bath, and she wakes up, she goes to the washroom, she checks her face, and she says the human body is composed of like 97% water. So it's no wonder that when I look in my face in the mirror, I don't look like me. And then she has a picture, a photograph of herself right beside the mirror, and then she puts on her makeup to make herself look like that picture. And then she gets a random phone call. Someone asks her, "Is it you?" "No, it's not me." And then she goes to, and then there's like a part where she relates to the dead German lady on a really deep level. And it's like almost as if the German lady is her double, because the German lady also owns a rat named Bear, and she owns a rat named Kuma in Japanese, which means bear. And then she has like all these, throughout her stories, she has all these myths that she sort of, that come from all different, that she just makes up, and it just sort of crisscrosses the boundaries between East and West in a way that is really strange, and that removes any sort of stable boundaries. And she's a Japanese-German writer, and she writes in both Japanese and German.
What's the name of it? So maybe you can, yeah.
I have a book right here, so.
Yeah, all right, that's great, yes. Yes, so yeah, excellent. What's your name?
Oh, Kevin.
Kevin. Kevin can be a very future presenter if you are a member of this society. You can be a presenter. Have any research project? Yes, you can. Excellent. Sounds amazing. Any other question? Yeah, it's like the east and west boundaries. We are a little bit stuck on that that paradigm, isn't it? I think it's a time to go overcome and go beyond that to make our conversation or discussion more rich, because it's like almost like something that's stuck. It's like binary. It's like as if we should really always talk about binaries, and while there are so many things that's not mapped through the binary. So maybe it's old legacy, and Western is binaries itself. Any more questions? Oh, there are two more questions. Let me. Okay, I'm going to be.
They pass around.
Okay. Well, because they can't really see it. Right. Okay, two more questions, and Moongyung and Lex.
Mine's more of a comment, I guess.
Comment, please.
Personal aspect to it.
Let's don't do it now. Okay.
with the metaphor of fish, being able to go multidirectional and like being able to, you know, like go in and out of things. And I think, and I was really glad to hear that you talked about it as a privilege rather than, you know, being something of a struggle or something that you suffer from. Because, well, I felt a similar way until like just recently, which is like this hyphenated identity is really a struggle for a lot of immigrants or the kids, the children of the first generation immigrants. And I think it really becomes a privilege because, as Soyoung explained at the like opening the keynote presentation, it is like an identified space, so it becomes like a power field, like decentralized power field that you can exploit from, use to your advantage to, you know, develop your creativity. Like instead of being stuck in one place or being stagnant in like one single identity. Like I myself is Korean, but I recently achieved the Canadian citizenship. So like it took me, I've been living here for like almost 15 years now, but it took me 12 years to make up my mind to, you know, let's get the citizenship and become a Canadian, a Korean Canadian. So I think making that into a privilege comes from you being able to say you're okay with being, you know, not connected to my homeland, or, you know, like I'm ready to move beyond where I come from, and, you know, like you said, falling in and out of past and contemporary, so like being contemporary with the time that I'm living in and the space that I'm living in. So like, and I feel that this privilege is the only thing, well, not the only thing, but like a very powerful thing that new generations can exploit from and counter with, so to speak, white privilege. Because when, like, I've been researching a lot due to a paper that we were writing together before, and it almost felt like everywhere I turned, I was faced with the discussions about white privilege. So like, and it's such a powerful thing because it's so invisible. So like, what are we going to use as our weapon, so to speak, to counter white privilege? And I feel like even though we don't speak about it a lot as a privilege, I think our hyphenated identity or that unidentified space and the creativity that can come out of it is a real weapon that we can use, I guess, to counter that. And I think even though we all know about it, we don't speak about it enough, that for it to like have enough power to do that. So we're halfway through the presentations, and so far my impression of this forum is, you know, I'm really glad that we're all here together to speak about this, because the more we speak about it, the more people will know about it, and it will be just as powerful as it is.
I don't charge anyone, but I know that how therapeutic experience it might provide, even for me as well, and for yourself. Do you have any response to that? I mean, kind of empathetically we all understand, but do you have any response?
It was more of a thank you for speaking about
it. And then Lex, do you think is anything connected, or like maybe after response, or Lex?
I had a question about like some of the pieces rather than this, so maybe if you wanted to respond first.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. Yeah. It's not kind of privilege. It's such a like a lucky thing that we're able to like see many perspectives. Should appreciate it. Thank you for your response.
Yeah, I hope you develop further your works, and since I'm interested in becoming a curator, like would love to see more works that I could, you know, identify
two images that you showed before this one, I couldn't tell from looking at them. Are they 2D illustrations or are they like 3D graphics avatars?
Like this. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's from like, you know the app I am for you?
Okay.
Yeah. I like recently, I have like, I don't know, I was doing weird during Christmas and I just like downloaded the app and it's so funny. It's like following all the trends, you know, the Western trends, and now you can like dress her up and she's like, you know, she's cool. I think it's funny.
Okay, yeah, that's.
It's like a screenshot.
Yeah.
Any more comments and questions? One more? One more questions? Nothing? Okay. So, thank you very much. All right, thank you. And so while I'm changing